I remember the way the fluorescent lights of the doctor's office flickered faintly, buzzing like an insect trapped in a glass jar. My hands were folded tightly in my lap, the paper beneath me crinkling with every small shift, and I tried to steady my breathing as the words came out of his mouth. Surgery. Urgent. A window of time. Narrow and unforgiving. It wasn't a surprise. I had been feeling the signs for months, the exhaustion, the pain that spread like a quiet tide, but hearing it in clinical language made it real in a way I couldn't hide from anymore. My life had split into two distinct paths in that moment, the one where I survived and rebuilt, and the one where I didn't. As the doctor's voice trailed into medical terms and procedures, all I could think about was whether I would have someone to hold my hand on the other side of that thin hospital curtain. When I told him, later that night, I expected worry, perhaps even anger at the unfairness of it all. Instead, he nodded quickly, poured himself a drink, and told me not to stress. He promised, with the casualness of a man promising to water a neighbor's plants, that he would be there. "Of course I'll be by your side," he said, and I clung to that sentence like a lifeline. It wasn't the most passionate declaration, but it was enough to calm me in the haze of shock. I remember resting my head on the pillow that night, whispering to myself that I wasn't alone, that he would sit with me through the anesthesia, the recovery, the fragility that would follow. I didn't realize then that promises can be spoken not as commitments, but as shields, words meant to deflect responsibility rather than embrace it. The days after the diagnosis blurred into a strange rhythm of phone calls, medical forms, and trying to gather courage. I would catch myself staring at him across the room, wondering if he could see the fear that sat heavy on me. He was oddly cheerful during those days, distracted, his phone lighting up with messages that made him smile at odd moments. I convinced myself it was his way of coping, a distraction to keep from drowning in the reality of what was happening to me. It was easier to believe he was hiding his worry than to imagine anything darker. But the truth hides in the smallest of details, and I started noticing the cracks. A receipt left on the counter for a dinner I hadn't attended. A calendar reminder on his laptop, half hidden when I walked by. The way he lingered too long on the phone, speaking in a voice softer than the one he used with me. I wanted to tell myself I was being paranoid, that stress was distorting my perception, but the unease settled into my bones. Still, I held on to his promise, replaying it in my head like a prayer. Of course I'll be by your side. It is strange how fragile hope can be, how it bends and stretches under the weight of doubt. Every time I prepared a hospital bag, folded a set of clothes I might wear post-surgery, or checked the dates with my doctor, I anchored myself to the image of him sitting in that stiff hospital chair, holding my hand. I ignored the late nights, the unanswered calls, the vague explanations about meetings and work stress. I told myself it didn't matter. What mattered was that he promised. That was the thread keeping me together, even as the silence around his actions grew louder. Looking back now, I see how blind I was, how desperately I clung to the idea that love, even fractured, could be dependable when life demanded it most. But at the time, I was too tired to fight shadows. I needed stability, even if it was only the illusion of it. I let myself believe in him, even as the pieces of evidence stacked quietly in the corners of my life, waiting for the moment when they would tumble forward and crush the fragile hope I was holding. The diagnosis was the first blow, but his reaction, or the lack of it, was the one that carved a deeper wound. It was the beginning of a revelation I didn't yet have the strength to face. So I moved through those early days in a daze, balancing fear with denial, preparing for a surgery that could change everything, whispering to myself that he would be there when I woke up. What I didn't know then was that his promise was already hollow, already betrayed by plans he was weaving behind my back. And as I stood at the edge of that terrifying chapter, believing in the security of his presence, he was laughing with someone else, making reservations, and preparing for a different kind of escape, one that would shatter not only my trust, but also the very foundation of the life I thought I had built with him. The week leading up to the surgery felt like walking through fog. My mind was cluttered with paperwork from the hospital, reminders of blood tests, and stern instructions from my doctor about what I should and should not do. I carried all that weight quietly, trying not to let fear overtake me. He seemed so strangely detached, his life moving on an entirely different rhythm, as though my impending operation was only a minor inconvenience in his carefully arranged schedule. At first, I tried to excuse it. Maybe he was overwhelmed. Maybe he simply didn't know how to process the idea of me being vulnerable. But then, small signs began to stitch themselves into a larger, undeniable pattern. It started with something as mundane as checking the mail. An envelope was wedged between the electricity bill and a flyer, and I almost tossed it aside, but the bold lettering of the hotel chain caught my eye. It was addressed to him, though it bore our home address, and inside was a glossy confirmation slip for a reservation. The dates jumped out at me immediately, days that overlapped precisely with my scheduled surgery and recovery. I froze in the middle of the kitchen, staring at the paper as though reading it again and again would somehow change the reality of what was written. A suite reservation. Las Vegas. Non-refundable. I stood there for what felt like hours. The hum of the refrigerator, the only sound in the room. My pulse pounding in my ears. My mind scrambled for explanations, for some rational excuse that would make this nothing more than a misunderstanding. Perhaps it was work-related, some kind of corporate event he had forgotten to tell me about. But the description was too polished, too indulgent to be professional. Champagne service, spa package, VIP lounge access. It wasn't a business trip. It was a getaway. I folded the slip back into the envelope, my hands shaking not from rage, but from the sickening clarity that was beginning to set in. The promise he had given me, so casually to be by my side, had already been betrayed long before the words left his mouth. That night, I watched him more closely than ever. He sat on the couch with his phone, smiling at a screen I couldn't see, the faint reflection of neon colors flickering in his eyes. He laughed once, quietly to himself, as if someone had written him a private joke. I felt the envelope burning in the drawer where I had hidden it, but I didn't confront him yet. Instead, I listened as he told me he'd be busy with late meetings over the next week, that I shouldn't worry if he wasn't home on time. Each lie slid out smoothly, as though rehearsed, and I realized how practiced he must have become at keeping this second life concealed. The more I observed, the more glaring the inconsistencies became. His sudden obsession with his appearance. The new cologne he claimed was a gift from a coworker. The way he locked his phone with a new passcode after years of leaving it unguarded on the counter. It was as though, after so many years together, he had begun preparing for a different performance entirely. One where I no longer played a role. I tried to sleep that night, but the silence was suffocating. I stared at the ceiling and thought of the promises we had once exchanged. The vows to stand by each other in sickness and in health, in strength and in weakness. What did they mean to him now? The man who was supposed to anchor me in my most fragile moment was planning to sip champagne in a hotel suite, hiding his betrayal under the glittering lights of Las Vegas. The cruelty of it was not just in the act itself, but in the timing. He wasn't just betraying me. He was abandoning me when I would be most vulnerable, when I would be lying in a hospital bed with tubes in my arm and monitors tracking the rhythm of my heart. That knowledge settled inside me like lead, pressing against every breath. The following day, I searched for more. I needed to be sure. Needed the undeniable proof that this wasn't my imagination twisting shadows into monsters. It didn't take long. On his laptop, a tab left open by mistake revealed flight confirmations, complete with seat upgrades and priority boarding. I scrolled through the details, each click of the trackpad a blade slicing deeper into whatever remained of my trust. It wasn't just a trip. It was meticulously planned, with dinner reservations, show tickets, and spa appointments all lined up. I could almost hear his laughter echoing in those hotel hallways, see him clinking glasses under neon lights while I lay in recovery, alone. My chest tightened with the realization that I had been living beside a stranger who valued indulgence over loyalty, spectacle over care. I closed the laptop softly, careful not to disturb the stillness of the house, and sat back in the chair, staring into the darkened screen that had just exposed the truth. There was no longer room for excuses. The hidden reservation was not just a detail, it was the entire truth, laid bare in digital ink. He had chosen, and he hadn't chosen me. I thought of the surgery dates circled on the calendar, of the appointments, the preparation, the fear I was barely managing to contain. And then I thought of his calendar, filled with neon lights and slot machines, with a woman's laughter replacing the sound of mine. The betrayal was now tangible, something I could hold in my hand, read on paper, trace on a screen. I didn't cry, though the heaviness pressed against my ribs until it was difficult to breathe. Instead, I felt a cold clarity settling into place. This was not the end of the story. Not yet. The discovery was only the beginning, a key that would unlock what I had to do next. For now, I remained silent, pretending not to know, even as every gesture, every smile, every word he offered me turned into a performance I saw through completely. I held the secret close, waiting for the right moment to let it unfold. But the reservation was more than proof of betrayal. It was a map, pointing not to the future I thought we shared, but to the lies he had been living in plain sight. And now that I had found it, nothing could be the same again. I had always believed that the truth, when it finally rose to the surface, would be met with silence, with shame, with some flicker of regret in the eyes of the one who had been caught. I imagined the weight of evidence would crush arrogance, that when a man was faced with his own betrayal laid bare, the mask would slip and something human would finally emerge. Remorse, perhaps, or at least an attempt at apology. But when I finally chose to confront him, when the glossy papers and glowing screens had already revealed more than words ever could, what I received was not silence, not shame, not even denial. It was laughter, cruel, echoing, sharp laughter that made my skin crawl. It was late in the evening, the kind of night when shadows stretch long across the walls and the silence between two people becomes heavier than any argument. He had just come home, smelling faintly of cologne I knew he had bought for someone else, his tie loosened, his jacket tossed carelessly on the back of a chair. I had waited all day for this moment, rehearsing the words in my mind, wondering how to strike the balance between calmness and strength. I didn't want to scream, didn't want to beg. I only wanted to expose what he had so smugly hidden, to look him in the eye and let him see that I knew. I placed the envelope on the table, the one with the hotel confirmation inside, sliding it toward him without a word. His eyes flicked down, his hand froze for a fraction of a second, and then he smirked as if we were playing some kind of game. "So you found it," he said, his tone almost amused. I watched his face closely, waiting for the shift, for the crack in his performance, but it never came. He opened the envelope, glanced at the contents as if they were nothing more than a grocery list, and then tossed it back onto the table with a shrug. The casualness of it cut deeper than if he had shouted at me. It was not just betrayal, it was dismissal, as though my discovery was insignificant compared to his plans. I steadied my voice and asked him if he really intended to go to Las Vegas during the days of my surgery, if the woman he had been whispering to and laughing with was worth abandoning the person who had stood by him through years of sacrifice. For a brief moment, I thought he might at least attempt to lie, to spin another excuse, to soften the cruelty of the truth. Instead, he laughed. It wasn't the laugh of a man caught off guard, not even the laugh of someone embarrassed. It was the laugh of someone who believed himself untouchable, who believed my pain was nothing more than an inconvenience to his fun. He leaned back in his chair, shaking his head as though I were a child who had asked a foolish question. "Did you really think I would cancel Vegas because of your surgery?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, the words slicing through me with more force than any knife could. "Come on, you know me better than that." The world seemed to tilt in that moment, the ground shifting beneath my feet, as his words settled into me like poison. Every memory of our years together unraveled in an instant. The nights I stayed awake, comforting him through failures. The mornings I sacrificed my own rest to make sure he was cared for. The dreams I put aside so his could take center stage. All of it condensed into nothing in his eyes, erased by the lure of neon lights and a woman's laughter that wasn't mine. I stared at him, trying to find a trace of humanity, of guilt, but all I saw was contempt. He didn't care about my pain, my fear, or even my life. What mattered to him was indulgence, the thrill of escape, the freedom to live as though loyalty were an outdated concept he had no use for. I didn't cry, though the burn of tears pricked at the corners of my eyes. I didn't scream, though rage pulsed hot through my veins. Instead, I went cold, colder than I had ever felt before. His laughter still rang in my ears, bouncing off the walls like an echo I couldn't silence. But beneath that cruel sound, something inside me hardened. This was not just betrayal. This was mockery. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't even pretending to be sorry. He found my suffering laughable, my expectations ridiculous, my belief in his promises something to be ridiculed. That realization did not break me. It awakened me. I let him speak, let him ramble about how life was too short to give up opportunities for fun, about how I was overreacting, about how I should lighten up. Each word only dug the grave of our relationship deeper, though he didn't see it. He thought his laughter gave him power, that his cruelty placed him above me, untouchable. What he didn't realize was that it was in that moment, when he laughed at my surgery, at my fear, at the vulnerability I had no choice but to face, that I stopped being his victim. Something shifted in me, quiet, but irreversible. I understood then that his arrogance would be the very weapon I would use against him. I said nothing more that night. I watched him finish his drink, smirk to himself, and wander off to bed, leaving the envelope still on the table as though it meant nothing. But to me, it meant everything. It was the moment his mask slipped completely, revealing not just a man who betrayed, but a man who delighted in the cruelty of betrayal. It was the moment I realized that I no longer had anything left to lose, and he no longer had any idea what was coming for him. The confrontation didn't end with shouting or with tears. It ended with his laughter echoing in the darkness, and with me sitting in silence, planning the first steps of a revenge that would be as cold and calculated as the laugh that had just broken something inside me. The days that followed the confrontation blurred together in a haze of silence and suppressed rage. His laughter, that cruel and careless sound, echoed in the back of my mind, even in the quietest hours of the night, long after he had fallen asleep beside me, as if nothing in our world had shifted. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the rise and fall of his chest against the mattress, and wonder how someone could find amusement in the suffering of the person who had given them everything. The weight of it pressed down on me like a physical burden, heavier than the illness I carried, heavier even than the looming surgery that awaited me. It wasn't only the betrayal itself that hurt, but the casualness of it, the way he had dismissed me as if my life, my body, my fear were all obstacles in the way of his pleasure. I began to replay the years of our relationship in my mind, each memory reframed through the lens of that cruel laughter. The anniversaries where I had planned dinners, bought gifts, written letters he never seemed to read. The times I stayed up late to help him through professional failures, whispering words of encouragement when he doubted himself, even when I was exhausted. The countless sacrifices that I had quietly made so that his dreams could take priority, jobs I turned down, friends I lost touch with, pieces of myself I set aside because I believed in us, in the future we were supposed to be building together. All of it now felt like a ledger I had balanced with my own blood, only to discover that he had been spending my devotion on something I was never meant to see. It was not just the betrayal of fidelity that gnawed at me. It was the betrayal of trust, of promises spoken in dimly lit rooms when we were younger, when words like forever had not yet soured on our tongues. I thought of the mornings when I brewed coffee for him before work, the little notes I sometimes left on the counter when I knew he would wake after me, the way I had been there for him, even in the moments when I wanted to crumble myself. And now, when I was the one in need, when my body was betraying me with illness and I was vulnerable, he had chosen neon lights, hotel suites, and laughter that wasn't mine. He hadn't just failed me, he had erased me. In the quiet hours, I would find myself standing in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection as though searching for the woman who had once believed she mattered to him. I looked for the strength in my own eyes, the resolve that had carried me through challenges before, but often all I saw was weariness, the lines of stress etched deeper with every passing day, my skin pale from restless nights, and the constant pull of doubt. It wasn't simply heartbreak, it was a hollowing, a sense that something essential in me had been stolen without my consent. The man I had trusted most had not only stepped away from me when I needed him, but he had mocked the very idea of my need. That realization was heavier than any scalpel or anesthesia could ever be. I began to move through the house differently, quietly, cautiously, like a ghost observing the remnants of a life that had already ended. He seemed oblivious to the change in me, Or perhaps he didn't care. He continued his charade as if nothing had been revealed, laughing into his phone, making excuses about late nights at work, hiding receipts in drawers he thought I would never open. But I no longer confronted him. I no longer asked questions. The laughter from that night had told me all I needed to know. Any words I might have spoken would have been wasted against a man who had already decided that my suffering was not worth his attention. The betrayal settled into me like sediment, layering itself over the years of love and loyalty, until it suffocated the good memories beneath it. I couldn't look at him without feeling the sting of it, couldn't hear his voice without recalling the mocking tone in which he had spoken of my surgery, as though my life was an inconvenience to his entertainment. And yet, beneath the crushing weight, something else began to form. Something sharper, harder, colder than grief. It was a quiet awareness that the same years he had discarded so easily had built in me a strength he did not anticipate. For every sacrifice I had made, I had learned to endure. For every dream I had put aside, I had cultivated patience. For every betrayal I had endured, I had stored resilience. I carried all of it with me as the days passed, preparing for the surgery with a resolve that no longer relied on him. The fear was still there, of course. It clung to me in the sterile halls of the hospital during pre-surgery consultations, in the stacks of paperwork I filled out with trembling hands. But the fear was no longer compounded by the hope that he would save me from it. That illusion had died with his laughter. What remained was the raw truth. I was alone in this, and perhaps I had always been. But the difference now was that I no longer felt broken by the weight of his betrayal. It was crushing, yes, but it also forced me to see him clearly for the first time, without the blur of devotion clouding my vision. The weight was unbearable at times, but it also anchored me. It tethered me to reality, stripping away the fantasies I had clung to about love and loyalty. It reminded me that the man who had promised to stand by me was gone long before his body ever left my side. And in that recognition, in that painful clarity, I found the first threads of something I had not expected to feel so soon: resolve. The betrayal was heavy, suffocating, but it also gave me direction. If he had laughed at my vulnerability, then I would show him what strength truly looked like. If he had mocked my need for care, then I would reveal to him what it meant to be discarded. The weight of betrayal did not destroy me. It was reshaping me into something he would not recognize, something he would never see coming. The weight of betrayal had already sunk into me like an anchor, dragging me down into waters I had never thought I would tread. But as the days passed, the outline of the betrayal grew sharper, and its shadow began to take shape in a form that was not entirely his. It was not enough to know he had chosen neon lights over my surgery. Not enough to know he had mocked my need for him. Somewhere in the haze of receipts, hidden confirmations, and half-truths whispered through locked screens, I began to see her, an invisible presence at first, then clearer with every detail I uncovered. She was not just a nameless accomplice to his indulgence, not a faceless silhouette in a hotel suite. She was real, close, and far more intertwined with my life than I had ever allowed myself to imagine. It began with the perfume. The faint trace of something floral and unfamiliar clung to his shirt one evening, an undertone that no cologne could disguise. I had not worn perfume in weeks, perhaps even months, too consumed with hospital visits and the weight of my condition to bother with adornment. When I asked casually if he had been near someone wearing it, he waved it away with the kind of flippant denial that only fueled my certainty. Later that night, when he left his phone charging in the corner, I saw the notification light flicker once before it went dark. A woman's name I did not recognize glowed for just a moment on the screen. I memorized it before the phone dimmed again, holding it in my mind like a match struck in a cave. The name led me down a path I had not wanted to walk, but once I began, I could not stop. A search here, a social media profile there, the quiet gathering of details that built a portrait more vivid than I was ready to see. She was younger, yes, but not impossibly so. She lived nearby. She smiled in photos that spoke of ordinary days, coffee cups, vacations, office celebrations, and then there were the overlaps, the subtle hints that connected her world to mine. The restaurant receipts I had seen matched places she had posted pictures from. A concert ticket stub he had left in his pocket aligned with a photo she had shared of the same night. Slowly, inexorably, the shadow solidified, It was her. She wasn't just anyone. She was a colleague, someone he saw every day, someone who knew his routines as well as I did. The betrayal was no longer abstract. It had a face, a voice, a presence that hovered at the edges of my home, even when she was not physically there. The cruelest revelation was not that he had found another, but that he had built his lie with such precision that I had been standing inches from the truth for longer than I knew. He had brought her into spaces that were once mine, places where I had sat with him, laughed with him, dreamed with him. The thought of them sitting together in the very restaurant where he once celebrated my birthday, of her slipping into the passenger seat of the car we had chosen together, of her laughter replacing mine in the echo of the life we had shared. It was a corrosion, slow but merciless, eating away at the foundation of every memory I thought untouchable. The knowledge settled into me with a coldness I could not shake. It was no longer just about him mocking my surgery. It was about her shadow standing between us, making it clear that his choice was deliberate. He had not simply stumbled into temptation. He had built another life with her, brick by brick, even as I was left holding the crumbling walls of the one we were supposed to share. And yet, what struck me most was not her existence, but the way he carried it all so casually, as if neither I nor she mattered beyond the role we played in propping up his ego. To him, she was not a replacement for me, nor was I entirely disposable. We were interchangeable pieces in a game he believed he controlled, one where my suffering was laughable, and her presence was a prize he flaunted. But I was not blind, not anymore. Her shadow did not frighten me. It clarified my vision. She became less a rival and more a piece of evidence, proof of how far his betrayal reached. I watched him more carefully in those days, catching the small slips, the way his eyes flicked to his phone at dinner, the sudden need for privacy, the excuses that grew thinner with every lie. He thought he was clever, that I remained in the dark, but I had already pieced together enough to see the outline of the truth in full. Every trace of her only strengthened the cold resolve forming inside me. He believed his betrayal was invisible, that his laughter had erased my strength, but he could not see what was happening within me. I began to collect these shadows, quietly, meticulously, as though gathering weapons. Every receipt, every overlapping detail, every subtle connection between them became another thread I wove into a net I knew I would one day cast. I no longer needed to confront him with questions. I had answers of my own. And though the presence of another woman should have broken me, it did not. It reshaped me, just as the betrayal had. I no longer viewed myself as abandoned, but as awakened. The surgery still loomed, the fear still lingered, but alongside that fear was a growing fire, one that her shadow had inadvertently ignited. The other woman's shadow was no longer just an echo of his disloyalty. It was a reminder that he was not as careful as he believed. And in that shadow, I began to see the faint outline of my own plan, one that would eventually turn his laughter into silence, his arrogance into ruin, and his shadowed secret into the very thing that destroyed him. For now, I let the shadow linger, hovering in the background of my every thought. But I knew it would not stay there forever. It was only a matter of time before I dragged it into the light. The revelation of her presence should have shattered me completely, should have left me curled into myself with nothing but despair, but instead, it did something very different. It sharpened me, like a blade forged under pressure, honed not by rage but by clarity. I stopped asking why, stopped begging answers from a man whose laughter had already told me everything I needed to know. I no longer sought explanations, no longer waited for remorse that would never come. Instead, I began to retreat into silence. Not the silence of defeat, but the silence of calculation. Every word I didn't speak, every tear I didn't shed in front of him, became a brick in the fortress I was building inside myself. It was in that silence that the quiet decision was born. I would not be his victim. I would not allow his cruelty to define the way my story ended. He believed my silence was submission. I could see it in the smug way he carried himself through the house, in the smirk that lingered when he glanced at his phone, in the casualness with which he dismissed me when I asked nothing at all. He thought my quiet meant resignation, that I had accepted my role as the forgotten partner, the one left behind while he basked in neon lights and another woman's touch. But he mistook my silence for weakness, because he did not know me. Not truly. Not anymore. What lived inside me was not resignation, but a storm gathering strength beneath a calm surface. I learned to let him underestimate me, to let him laugh, to let him believe that I was too broken to act. In reality, I was observing, memorizing, planning. The decision itself did not come in a single dramatic moment. It was not a slam of a door or a shout in the night. It came gradually, like the slow tightening of a knot that grows unbreakable before anyone realizes it is there. It was in the way I began to keep copies of receipts instead of throwing them away. It was in the way I memorized passwords, in the way I saved screenshots and emails in places he would never look. It was in the way I smiled faintly when he told yet another lie, because every false word became a piece of ammunition I tucked away. I transformed my hurt into strategy, my anger into patience. And the more he laughed, the more fuel he unknowingly gave me. In those days, he would sometimes glance at me across the room, his eyes narrowing as if trying to decipher what I was thinking. But he never asked. Perhaps he didn't care, or perhaps he thought he already knew, that I was too fragile, too consumed by my illness, too diminished by the weight of betrayal to do anything more than endure. That was his greatest mistake. He had always underestimated the quiet strength it took to sacrifice, the endurance it took to hold a family, a relationship, a life together. He mistook kindness for frailty, and loyalty for dependency. He did not understand that when a woman who is given everything is stripped bare, what remains is not weakness, but steel. The quiet decision gave me a sense of control I had not felt in weeks. I no longer stumbled through the days consumed by fear of the surgery or suffocated by his cruelty. Instead, I felt myself beginning to breathe again, each inhale steadier, each exhale sharper, as if I were reclaiming space inside myself that he had occupied for too long. I did not tell anyone at first, not friends, not family. This was mine, my secret, my plan. To share it would be to weaken it, to risk someone trying to dissuade me or, worse, warn him. And so I carried it alone, nurturing it in silence, feeding it with every piece of evidence, every casual betrayal, every shadow that trailed him when he thought I wasn't watching. I remember standing in front of the mirror one morning, brushing my hair slowly, and realizing that my face looked different. Not younger, not softer, harder, steadier. The lines of grief and exhaustion were still there, but behind them was something new, something fierce. I whispered to myself that I would survive, not just the surgery, but this betrayal too, and I would not simply survive, I would rise. He thought Las Vegas would be his escape, his triumph, but he had no idea that by mocking my pain, by laughing at my vulnerability, he had given me the very weapon I needed. His arrogance was the crack in his armor, and I would exploit it. The decision was quiet, yes, but it was absolute. I would not confront him again with questions he would only laugh at. I would not plead for decency from a man who had already proven he had none. Instead, I would wait. I would gather. I would plan. And when the moment came, I would not simply expose him. I would dismantle him, piece by piece, until the man who had mocked me in my weakest moment was left with nothing but the echo of his own laughter to keep him company. That was the power of the quiet decision. It was invisible to him, hidden behind the mask of the woman he believed was broken. But inside me, it grew stronger every day. A silent vow that his betrayal would not be the end of my story, but the catalyst for the rebirth of a woman he would never again have the power to diminish. Once the decision crystallized inside me, my world shifted. The fear that had once consumed me began to loosen its grip, replaced not with joy or peace, but with purpose. Every day became a quiet operation, every interaction an opportunity to collect what I would need. I moved through the house like an archivist, cataloging, storing, memorizing. He thought I was distant because of the surgery, because of fatigue, and he welcomed it, for it gave him freedom to indulge in his lies without the pressure of my questions. He had no idea that my silence was not absence, but surveillance, that I was watching, listening, gathering the pieces that would one day form the weapon I needed to bring him down. The first things were easy. Receipts tossed carelessly into pockets or left crumpled on the counter. Ticket stubs he didn't bother to hide. Small slips of carelessness that spoke louder than any confession. I began to save them, sliding them into a folder I tucked away inside my closet, hidden beneath clothes he never touched. Each one was a timestamp, a breadcrumb leading back to a truth he believed invisible. The dates lined up too perfectly with his excuses. The locations matched places where I knew she had been. Every new piece of paper felt heavy in my hand, not because it hurt me anymore, but because I knew what it would mean when I laid it all out. But I did not stop at the careless traces he left behind. I grew bolder. At night, when he was asleep with his phone clutched loosely in his hand, I would wait for his breathing to deepen, for the rhythm of sleep to settle over him. Then, carefully, slowly, I would slip it free and scan through the messages. He was careful, yes, deleting often, but never enough. A fragment of a conversation remained here, a name there, a photograph sent without context. I learned to screenshot quickly, to send copies to an email account he didn't know existed, one I had set up only for this purpose. My hands shook the first time I did it, but soon the tremor was replaced by precision. Every time I pressed save, I felt less like a wounded wife, and more like a strategist in the middle of a campaign. The laptop, too, became a source of discovery. He guarded it closely, but habits are hard to break, and more than once he left it unattended, logged in, believing I was too disinterested to care. I memorized his passwords, not in one attempt, but in fragments, watching the motions of his fingers when he typed, piecing them together like solving a puzzle. Once inside, the world unfolded. Travel confirmations, messages disguised under false names, shared documents that included itineraries meant for two, the hotel reservations, the airline tickets, the dinner bookings. They were all there. Digital proof that his betrayal was not spontaneous, but orchestrated. I printed copies quietly, one by one, until the folder in my closet grew thick with evidence. It wasn't only paper and screens that betrayed him. People talk, even when they don't mean to. A friend's careless remark about seeing him at a bar when he claimed to be working late, a neighbor mentioning a car parked outside at unusual hours, a coworker's slip about a weekend trip. Each story, each stray comment, became another thread I wove into my net. I learned not to react, to nod as if uninterested, but inside I recorded every detail. The truth was no longer a question. It was a tapestry I was weaving. Every thread a reminder that he thought me blind when I was anything but. Even she, the shadow who had intruded into my life, left traces. Her social media became a mirror to his lies. Photos cropped carefully but with reflections in windows, or glasses that betrayed his presence. Captions that aligned with receipts I already had. I saved those too, watching the curated version of their affair play out in filtered images, knowing I would one day strip the filters away for everyone to see. She thought herself clever, thought the secrecy romantic, but the internet does not forget, and I was there to gather every fragment. Through it all, I remained outwardly calm. I cooked dinners, folded laundry, listened to him speak of his busy days with a polite nod. He mistook my quiet for detachment, never realizing that I was sharpening every piece of his betrayal into a blade. And the more he believed I was too weary to notice, the more careless he became, laughing too loudly into the phone, leaving browser tabs open, forgetting to erase entire threads of conversation. My folder grew heavy, my email account fuller, my resolve sharper. There were nights when I sat alone, the folder open before me, the pages spread across the bed like a map of destruction. I would trace the dates with my fingers, lining them up against the calendar of my life, seeing how easily he had slipped away while I sat in doctors' offices, while I scheduled appointments, while I prepared for a surgery that terrified me. Rage should have consumed me then, but what I felt was colder, more enduring. It was the satisfaction of knowing that when the time came, I would not simply accuse him. I would dismantle him. He would not be able to laugh it away, would not be able to shrug off the truth as exaggeration. I would have proof, undeniable and devastating. The gathering of evidence was not just preparation, it was transformation. With every screenshot, every receipt, every whispered comment, I was shedding the skin of the woman he thought he knew. I was no longer the partner waiting for his loyalty. I was the architect of his downfall. And as the folder grew, So did my patience. I did not want to rush. Timing was everything. The right moment would come, and when it did, I would not need to raise my voice. The evidence would speak for me, louder and clearer than anything I could ever say. And so I waited, silent and steady, while he laughed in the shadows of his own making. He believed the game was his, but he had already lost. He just didn't know it yet. The folder was full by then, so heavy with the weight of his deceit that even lifting it from its hiding place felt like carrying another person's life in my hands. I had every scrap I needed: receipts, confirmations, screenshots, photographs, stray comments, pieces of truth he thought too small to matter, but that together painted the full picture of who he had become. I had rehearsed the moment in my mind for weeks, playing out different scenarios, different settings, different tones of voice I might use when the truth finally spilled into the open. Yet no matter how I shaped it in my imagination, one thing was certain. It had to be public. His cruelty had been public in its own way, his laughter echoing through my life without shame, his betrayal bold enough to leave traces in places anyone could find. And so his unmasking, too, would have witnesses. He would not escape into excuses when eyes beyond mine were watching. The opportunity came more naturally than I expected. A family gathering, one of those obligatory dinners where everyone sits around a long table, clinking glasses and smiling too wide, pretending harmony exists where it does not. He insisted we attend, perhaps believing that our presence together would reinforce the illusion of normalcy, that my silence meant complicity. I agreed easily, almost too easily, my calmness so unshakable that he never noticed the faint tremor of anticipation beneath it. As I dressed that evening, I slid a slim envelope into my bag, the one containing carefully chosen copies of the most damning evidence. I had thought about bringing the whole folder, but that wasn't necessary. I didn't need everything, only enough to pierce the mask and leave no room for denial. The dinner unfolded with its usual small talk and laughter, the clatter of cutlery and the murmur of overlapping conversations. He performed well, smiling at relatives, making jokes, reaching for my hand at carefully chosen moments as if to display to the room that everything between us was intact. Each time his fingers brushed mine, I felt a wave of cold satisfaction, because I knew what was coming, and he didn't. I waited, patient, letting him bask in the safety of his performance. And then, when the conversation drifted to plans and travels, when someone casually asked him about vacations and he launched into a story about how busy he had been with work, I knew it was time. I leaned back, opened my bag, and slid the envelope onto the table with deliberate calm. The paper looked innocuous, but I felt the energy shift instantly. Conversations faltered as eyes turned toward me, then to the envelope, then back to him. He frowned, confused, reaching for it. I did not stop him. I let him pull the papers free, let his eyes scan the familiar confirmations and screenshots, let the silence grow thick around us as the lies he had spoken only moments earlier unraveled before everyone's eyes. His smirk faltered, his color drained, and for the first time in weeks, he was silent. I spoke then, not loudly, but with enough clarity that every ear at the table could hear. I explained calmly what he had chosen, how while I prepared for surgery, he had prepared for Las Vegas. I named her, the woman who had lingered in the shadows of our lives, and I described in detail the dinners, the hotels, the trips, all backed by the proof that now lay in front of him. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I did not let anger distort the edges of my words. I was cold, deliberate, the way a surgeon might explain the steps of a procedure before making the first incision. The silence around the table grew oppressive, broken only by the faint clinking of a glass being set down too hard, the shuffle of someone shifting uncomfortably in their seat. His response was pitiful. He stammered at first, tried to laugh it off, reaching for that same cruel sound he had once used against me, but it died in his throat. The witnesses stripped him of that power. He tried denial, but the papers in his hands betrayed him. He tried deflection, muttering something about stress, about misunderstandings, but the screenshots and dates aligned too perfectly for even the most generous imagination to twist. His voice cracked, his mask shattered, and the room that once offered him applause now held only silence and judgment. He had spent years crafting an image of charm and competence, but in those minutes it collapsed, leaving only a hollow man exposed in the harshest light. I did not gloat. I did not smile. This was not triumph in the way he might have expected. It was justice, quiet and merciless. The humiliation was his alone to carry. I felt nothing but release, as though the weight I had been dragging behind me had finally been cut loose. The eyes around the table did the rest of the work. They saw him for what he was, and in their silence, in their refusal to rescue him with laughter or excuses, he crumbled further. I had wanted witnesses not for validation, but because betrayal thrives in secrecy, and I would not allow his to remain hidden. In that room, in that moment, there was no longer anywhere for him to run. When the dinner ended, he avoided my gaze, his movements jerky, his face pale. The envelope lay abandoned on the table, its contents scattered, undeniable. Relatives avoided him, whispered among themselves, cast glances that were no longer admiring but appalled. The performance he had so carefully staged for years had ended not with applause, but with silence thick enough to choke him. I walked out with my head high, the cold night air filling my lungs with a sense of clarity I had not felt in months. The public unmasking was not the end. I knew that. It was only the beginning of his unraveling. But it was the moment I had been waiting for, the strike that split open the facade he had worn so confidently. And as I walked away from the house, leaving him behind in his shame, I realized that the laughter he had once used to diminish me was gone. In its place was silence. His silence, born not of strength but of defeat, and that silence was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. After the dinner, the house no longer felt the same. He walked through it like a stranger, his steps heavier, his voice muted, the weight of the unmasking still clinging to him like a second skin he could not shed. He avoided my eyes, avoided mirrors, avoided anything that might reflect back to him the image of the man everyone had seen that night, not the charming, confident figure he had spent years cultivating, but a liar stripped bare, a coward caught in the light. The air between us was thick with his shame and my silence. I did not need to remind him of what had been revealed. The whispers of our relatives, the judgment in their stares, the evidence burned into his memory. All of it did the work for me. His arrogance had collapsed in public, and now, piece by piece, the dream he had clung to so tightly began to crumble around him. Las Vegas had been his great escape, his secret stage where he believed he could reinvent himself without consequence. He had painted it as the glittering prize that justified his betrayal, the indulgence that mattered more than my body, my health, my life. But now that dream began to rot from the inside. The woman who had once hovered like a shadow at the edges of my life started to pull away from him. I could see it in the way his phone no longer buzzed with late-night messages, the way his eyes grew darker when he checked it and found silence. She had not signed up for exposure. She had been lured by secrecy, by the thrill of being chosen in the dark. But when that darkness was split open, she recoiled. He was no longer desirable, no longer untouchable. He was a man whose lies had been paraded across a dinner table for all to see. A man marked by failure, and her absence in his orbit told me she had no interest in being tethered to a sinking ship. The collapse of his Vegas dream revealed itself most clearly the day he tried to salvage it. I overheard him on the phone, his voice low and frantic, insisting that the trip was still on, that he could explain, that the situation was exaggerated. His words stumbled, desperate, nothing like the mocking confidence he had once wielded against me. I did not need to know who was on the other end. I could hear it in his tone, the pleading that came only when someone who once admired him no longer did. The silence that followed, the click of the call ending, was final. When he lowered the phone, his face was pale and drawn, and for the first time, he looked small to me, not powerful, not cruel, just diminished. Yet it wasn't only her rejection that crushed him. The dream itself, the shows, the suites, the champagne nights, became poisoned. The reservations, once symbols of indulgence, now lay useless. The very dates aligned with the humiliation he had endured. He could not step into that city without carrying the echo of my words, the eyes of those who had witnessed his downfall. I imagined him trying to sip champagne, trying to smile under the neon lights, but everywhere he turned he would see the shadow of what he had lost. Betrayal tastes sweet only when hidden, In the open, it curdles. And that was his reality now. Every indulgence he had craved turned bitter in his mouth. At home, his collapse became more obvious in the way he avoided his own reflection. He stopped dressing sharply, stopped carrying himself with that arrogant ease, stopped filling the rooms with his laughter. He shrank, his voice quieter, his steps tentative, as if waiting for another blow to fall. And I gave him nothing. My silence became his torment, my refusal to acknowledge him a mirror he could not escape. He wanted me to fight, to scream, to give him something to push against. But I gave him only absence. The absence of attention, the absence of care, the absence of the woman who had once built her life around his comfort. That void became heavier than any confrontation could have been. I watched it all with a calm detachment, like observing the steady collapse of a building I had already evacuated. There was no satisfaction in his suffering, not the kind he might have expected. There was only inevitability. He had chosen this path the moment he laughed at my pain, the moment he decided that neon lights mattered more than my life. His dream of Vegas, of escape, of indulgence, was not stolen from him. It crumbled because he built it on the fragile bones of lies, and lies do not hold when the truth is laid bare. The final crack came one morning when I found him sitting at the kitchen table, the envelope of evidence spread out before him, his hands clutching his head. He looked up at me then, his eyes bloodshot, his lips parted as if to speak, but there were no words left. What could he say? Apologies were ashes now, excuses empty, promises void. He had once laughed at me, mocked the very idea of standing by me in my most fragile moment, and now he sat hollow, stripped of the dream that had fueled his arrogance. I walked past him without a word, poured myself coffee, and sat down across the room. The silence stretched between us, vast and unbridgeable, and in that silence, I knew his Vegas dream was dead. What remained of him was only the shell of a man who had believed himself untouchable. And what remained of me was not the woman he had laughed at, not the broken figure he thought he had left behind. I was colder now, stronger, anchored by the clarity his cruelty had forced upon me. The collapse of his dream was not the end of my story, but it was the end of his illusion. And in watching him unravel, in seeing the fantasy he clung to disintegrate piece by piece, I felt the quiet affirmation that justice, in its own relentless way, had begun. In the aftermath of his collapse, the house no longer echoed with the same hollow rhythm it once had. For months, his laughter had been a weapon, his arrogance a constant shadow, and his betrayal the air I was forced to breathe. But now the silence that filled the rooms no longer suffocated me. It liberated me. The man who had mocked my illness, who had chosen neon lights, and another woman over my most fragile hour, sat diminished in the ruins of his own choices. And I, who had been the subject of his cruelty, began to find myself again. The rebirth was not sudden, not a single sunrise that washed everything clean, but a steady unfolding, as if I were peeling away layers of grief, one by one, to reveal something stronger beneath. At first, it was in the small things. Waking up and realizing my first thought was not about him, not about the betrayal, but about myself. The morning coffee tasted different when it was brewed only for me. The bitterness softened by the quiet knowledge that I no longer carried his weight with every sip. I began to reclaim spaces that had been suffocating under his presence. The chair in the corner where he once sprawled became my place to read again. The silence of the evenings became a canvas for music or words, instead of the backdrop to his excuses. Even the bed, once divided by the gulf between us, became my own. I stretched across it, let the sheets wrap around me, and felt, for the first time in so long, that solitude was not loneliness, but freedom. The surgery came and went, and though fear walked beside me into that sterile room, it was not his hand I reached for, nor did I need it. Friends appeared, quietly but faithfully, standing in places he had abandoned without hesitation. Nurses offered more comfort in their gentle voices than he had ever offered in his promises. When I opened my eyes afterward, groggy but alive, I realized that his absence had not destroyed me. It had only revealed how unnecessary he truly was. The strength that carried me through recovery did not come from him, nor from anger alone, but from the decision I had made in silence. that I would not be his victim, that I would rebuild, not because he had broken me, but because I refused to remain broken. With each passing day, the fragments of the woman I had once been began to realign into something new. I was no longer the wife who waited at the window for him to come home, no longer the partner who sacrificed dreams for his comfort. I was someone who had seen betrayal in its rawest form, who had faced humiliation, and yet refused to collapse under its weight. That knowledge became a shield, an armor forged from pain, but strengthened by resolve. I carried it with me into every step of my new life, a reminder that even the deepest wound can heal into something unbreakable. He lingered, of course, circling the edges of my life like a ghost who didn't realize he was dead. He tried to reclaim scraps of dignity, muttering apologies when the silence became too much, offering promises as empty as the ones that had once bound me to him. But his words no longer touched me. They fell flat, harmless, as if spoken in a language I no longer understood. I did not respond with anger, nor with forgiveness, but with indifference, the truest form of freedom. For indifference meant he no longer had the power to shape my days, my nights, or my heart. The rebirth was not about revenge, though I had delivered it. It was not about his downfall, though I had orchestrated it. It was about standing in the mirror one morning, brushing my hair, and realizing that the woman staring back at me was no longer hollowed by betrayal. She was whole, scarred perhaps, but stronger for it. Her eyes no longer searched for validation in someone else's gaze. They carried their own fire, one that had been born in the darkest hours and had burned steadily ever since. I began to make plans again. Not for us, not for him, but for me. Travels I had postponed, books I had wanted to write, friendships I had neglected. Life stretched ahead not as something I had to endure, but as something I could finally claim. The betrayal had been a crucible, but out of it I had stepped not as ashes, but as steel. And while he sat among the ruins of his vaguest dream, clinging to the fragments of a life he had shattered with his own hands, I walked forward, unburdened. Sometimes, late at night, I would think back to that moment when he laughed at me, when he mocked the idea that he would give up his indulgence for my survival. That laugh had once broken me, but now it no longer echoed in my mind. Instead, it served as a reminder of the exact moment my rebirth began. For when he laughed at my pain, he thought he had diminished me. He thought he had proven himself untouchable. But what he had truly done was awaken a strength in me he could never match. And so the story did not end with his betrayal, nor with his collapse, but with my rebirth. I was no longer defined by his cruelty. I was defined by my survival, by my decision to rise, by the quiet fire that now burned unshakably within me. The life I stepped into after him was not the one I had once imagined, but it was mine, wholly and completely. And that, above all, was the victory he could never take from me.